Hello, welcome everybody to BookFest 2022. I'm your moderator, Leslie Ann Moore. I am the past president of the Greater Los Angeles Writers Society. I'm the author of 4 published novels, including the award-winning epic fantasy, romantic fantasy Griffin's Daughters trilogy, as well as my new series, science fantasy, the New Tierra Chronicles, the first of which, Skein of Fates, won both a gold and silver award in last year's BookFest Awards. So I'm going to jump right in. The name of our panel today is Sci-Fi, Fantasy, Time Travel, Horror, Oh My. It's kind of broad, but I think we can get in some good information. So first, what I'd like to do is have everybody introduce themselves, please, and just tell us a little bit about yourself and what your latest project is. Let's start with Mike Robinson.
Hello, so I am Mike Robinson. I've been writing speculative fiction since I was about 6, professionally since I was 19. I published 10 books, 9 novels, and 1 collection of short stories, all of which kind of weave in and out of science fiction, fantasy, horror, weird fiction, curio fiction, everything in between. I've got a new horror fantasy, Walking the Dusk, releasing in May of next year, and I've been a book editor for about 15 years.
Very good. And let's move on to Robert J. Sawyer.
Hi, I'm Robert J. Sawyer from Toronto, Canada. I'm the past president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. I've won the Hugo and Nebula Awards for Best Novel of the Year. I have 24 science fiction novels to my credit, including Flash Forward, the basis for the ABC TV series of the same name, and my most recent book, The Oppenheimer Alternative.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And our last guest, Mr. Rose, please.
Yes, my name is Mark J. Rose. I'm the author of the Matt Miller and the Colonies series. Right now, there are 3 books in the series, Journeyman, Prophet, and Virginian. And the 4th book in the series, Architect, should be out sometime late this year, early next year. I live in La Jolla, California. During the day, I'm director of research at a startup biotech company. So I develop drugs for a living, but very early in the morning and at night, I write books. And like I said, hopefully the 4th book in the series will be out by the end of the year.
Okay, very, very good, everybody. All right, so let's start with a good question, tried and true. Actually, I think some of you had answered this already about how long you've been writing, but I'd like to know what was your very first published work? Whoever wants to start.
My very first published work was in my university's literary annual. I went to Ryerson University in Toronto, recently renamed Toronto Metropolitan University, and a great fantasy writer, went on to be a great fantasy writer. Ed Greenwood happened to be 2 years ahead of me. He was the editor of the literary annual and published my first story. And subsequently, Isaac Asimov, the great science fiction writer, picked it up for an anthology he was co-editing called 100 Great Fantasy Short Stories. So the first publication for me was 1980, 42 years ago.
Okay. Mike?
So the one that I usually start with is when I was 19, I had my first short story sale to the Canadian magazine Storyteller. I'm not sure it's around anymore, but it was for a kind of a Twilight Zone-y short story called The Hand of Spud. And and I made the cover too, which was kind of cool. They did a cover art for the story. But going back even further, technically my first publication, if you want to get very specific, was when I was 11, and I wrote a kind of a contemporary or urban science fiction story that was published online. And this was a very early internet, so that's why I didn't really think of it as published, even though nowadays it probably would be considered as such. But it won, I think it was runner-up in a contest back in the day that a juvenile YA series was running. So yeah, those were my two earliest publications.
And Mark, what about you?
So I think I have a little bit different journey, I guess. Maybe I messed around with various kind of pieces of fiction way back when. But really, my published articles have been scientific in nature, right? So I've written reviews. And so around 1996, I graduated with my PhD, and so it was a requirement, really, actually, for the best PhD students to have some sort of publications. And so the first publications were scientific articles, and then I think that my first real fiction piece I started writing probably 2005, and that's when I started writing Journeyman. But it really wasn't published until 2016 when I decided to take up writing again.
Okay, well, my very first published work was a poem when I was 9 years old. It was a poem about a horse, and my mother sent it into a national horse magazine, unbeknownst to me, and they published it. So I can say that I was actually published at age 9, this poem about a red horse. But then, of course, there was a huge gap, and so I didn't publish anything else until I put out Griffin's Daughter in 2009. So anyway, so let's jump into something a little bit meatier here. So right now, the science fiction fantasy genre is in the ascendancy, I think, in terms of media, like visual media, movies and TV. But most of it is based on either comic books or recycled IP, intellectual property, for those who don't know. So as authors, published authors, do you feel like there is any avenue for newer voices to get their works made into visual media like TV or movies?
Well, as a guy who had something made into a television series, as I said in the introduction on ABC, Flash Forward in 2009, starring Joe Fiennes and John Cho, newer authors, older authors, it doesn't make any difference. What Hollywood is looking for is the high concept, or sometimes called the elevator pitch, the one line that they can use internally to sell it. To get a TV show or a movie made, about 300 people in a process have to sign off on it being made. And only one at the very beginning has probably actually read your work. The rest will be going on that one line. Yeah, we can make money out. That sounds good. Okay. For Flash Forward, it was everybody on Earth blacks out for 2 minutes. When they wake up, they find that they've had visions of the future 6 months down the road. Boom. Okay. You can understand that. You can explain it to somebody in one sentence. So if you have a high concept, you've got a really good chance of at least getting somebody interested in it. If it takes longer to explain than I've taken to answer this question, forget it. Not a prayer, given the way the electronic media work.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I mean, sure, that I would second that for sure. I would say too that, you know, when you're agented and you sell, and your agent sells a book of yours, it's usually listed, the sale is usually listed in Publishers Marketplace, and very often studios will see that listed and contact your agent with interest to see the material. Very often nothing comes of it, or they put it on file for later. So you might get some, you know, a call like 5-10 years later if someone comes upon it. The right person working at the studio happens to come upon whatever pool of material they might have access to. I would also just say too, really quickly, that I think it's very beneficial for prose writers these days to also develop their screenwriting chops and maybe adapt their own work into a screenplay. So, you know, it'll pay dividends just on many different levels, from career building to just even economizing your prose and sharpening your story and your storytelling craft.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was wandering around LA probably over the course of like 5 to 8 years with screenplays. I have 4 finished screenplays, won a few kind of low-level contests, and then wound up pitching them to maybe 30 or 40 different production companies. It's a tough world. There are so many good screenplays. I think you do have to be part of a system. I thought that they were good screenplays. I still do. But again, there are a lot of good screenplays, and I do think you have to have a support network of people that pull you up above, the other good screenplays that are out there. Eventually, I got very frustrated with it. And that's when I gave up writing for 2 years. I was at the Austin Film Festival pitching, and just based on the people that I was meeting and the feedback I was getting, and I was like, I'm done. And I actually left halfway through the conference, and I said, I'm out of here. I'm done writing. I'm going to go back to science. I'm never going to touch a keyboard again, as far as creative writing. So yeah, it's frustrating. But I'm going to say, yeah, there are a lot of good screenplays. I still don't know how to break into that world. No idea.
I think it's always required dogged perseverance, but I think especially now so too, because there's so much noise and the marketplace is so saturated and there's so much content everywhere.
Also, it can be very frustrating for writers who don't have agents.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And that kind of leads me into the next question. The world of indie publishing has really changed a lot in even just the last 10 years or so. And it used to be that it was kind of looked down upon, kind of frowned upon. But now there are just so many people out there who've just decided, I'm not going to go with the gatekeepers. I'm going to put my own work out there. So I happen to enjoy reading indie published works. So I'd like to ask the panel, do you read indie works? In other words, self-published works. And if so, what was the last indie book you read, and did you enjoy it?
The answer is yes, occasionally, but it's usually work by my friends. But that's also true of traditionally published books. I write fiction for a living, so my leisure reading is nonfiction, because otherwise my evenings end up being just more work, right? Studying and learning craft and all that kind of stuff. So the most recent one I read was a novel called Shadow of Versailles by Hayden Trenholm, Trenholm, a mystery novel by a Canadian political insider, but it's actually set in France just after World War I. And an excellent book. But I don't read an awful lot of fiction, but I'm not at all averse to the notion of self-published novels now. Whereas you were absolutely right, Leslie Ann, when you suggested that some years back, it was the hallmark of an amateur writer. That certainly is not the case anymore.
Yeah, I agree. Mike, what about you?
Well, so I think the last book that I read that was fully self-published was Breakthrough, about communication with dolphins. I'm blanking on the author's name, but it was good. The last indie published, as in it was a very small press, book that I read was Oh My Days, I think by David Matthew. And that was incredible. That was really, really good. I was sad that didn't get wider reach. Mm-hmm. But I completely agree that indie publishing has become, hopefully, like indie film. It's a cool thing to do. It's a totally legitimate way to get your work out there, especially, as I said, in this saturated market.
Yes.
I don't want to step on Mark's turn, but I feel that the author you just mentioned needs his credit. So it's Michael C. Grumley, who wrote Breakthrough. Grumley,
yes.
Grumley.
Thank you.
We got to do the favor for
absolutely,
our indie colleagues.
Yes, thank you.
Mark, what about you?
I want to say the title, but I don't know the author. And if I could get my assistant to pull it down, the book is called No Good Time to Die. I had read it over the summer. Keep going to the right. There it is. But I wanted to say the author's name, but yeah, I was asked to review the book actually from an independent publisher, and you kind of get stuff like this all the time, and it's so yeah, this is the book, No Good Day to Die, actually. And I was like, oh, I don't know. And then finally I got the book, and it's twice as long as any other book that I picked up, right? And I'm like, wow, this is going to be a real commitment. But, then I started digging into it. It's quite a good book. And it's based on something that I'm really interested in. The man's name is James Wolfe. Yeah, I was like thankful that I had the opportunity to review it. And kind of one of those magical things. Otherwise, I always feel like I don't have enough time to read these days because I'm always doing some kind of research for my own books. And since I write time travel historical fiction, I'm always digging into the period and the just everything about the time that I'm writing the books in. And so I don't have enough time to read fiction like I would like.
One thing that I would say that and maybe this is in the era of customized news feeds, this is a knock on me for not, unwittingly being enrolled in this particular algorithm, but I don't get a lot of lists of great indie books just in my general news feeds. Like I get a lot of lists of traditionally published books, the fall's great horror books. And generally they don't cover self-published books or indie published books. So I'd like to see more of that. I'm sure that there are those lists. I just don't see them being disseminated.
I'm on Twitter a lot, and that's where I have found all of the good indie writers that I read. And so if you're on Twitter, you'll get a lot of lists of indie books that people will pass around. So right. It's a really good resource. I just got through reading really just a wildly inventive fantasy novel called Merchants of Knowledge and Magic by a young lady who lives up in the Pacific Northwest. Her name is Erica McCorkle. And it's part of just a huge universe that she writes in called the Pentagonal Dominion. And there's no humans in this world at all. It's all, she has these 88 sapient species that she writes about. And some of them are just, their physical characteristics are so just crazy, wildly inventive. It's a fantasy a fantasy series that's very quirky. It's very unique. And I enjoyed it very much.
The other thing I wanted to mention is I do think that indie publishing has, it goes to what Mike was saying, noise, and it's not all good. There's a lot of, if you can publish stuff, there's a lot of kind of stuff that doesn't actually go through an editor, doesn't go through the right proofreading. It has created a higher noise level to try to rise above. I don't know how we deal with that.
Well, I would like to say for indie writers who are watching this panel that it's really important, just because you don't have an agent or a publisher per se, it's really important to treat this professionally. Mm-hmm. So that means getting your work professionally edited. That means paying the money to have a cover, to have good cover art. Don't just try to make it yourself or give your nephew or your kid brother to do it. You got to pay people to get good work. Otherwise, it is just noise. It doesn't look professional at all. That's the only way for indie writers to get themselves taken seriously, is if they treat it as a professional does.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important.
You don't want anyone saying, "Oh, it was just self-published." You want to just, you want them to be completely absorbed in what you have to offer.
Exactly. Okay, so let's get into what we like to write in terms of scenes. So what types of scenes do you all enjoy writing most? I'm just going to come out and say it. I love writing sex scenes, okay? Love writing them. I think I'm pretty good at it. I don't write romance per se, and I don't write sex novels per se, but I do enjoy writing sex scenes. But what about the rest of you? Let's start with Mark.
I think my favorite scenes, I was a big Jack London fan, so Call of the Wild. And I actually went back to read Call of the Wild again because I remember it being such a good animal perspective. And some of my favorite chapters in my second book, my series, have been from the perspective of a dog and from the perspective of a horse, and trying to dig into their minds as only Jack London, could do well. And so that's been my favorite. And then I think that really now I'm past that, and it's more introspective kinds of things when people are by themselves in a room thinking about their lives and their situation and making plans, and what they're doing while they're experiencing this introspection.
Mine, atmospheric description. I just love, describing a scene, a setting, especially if it involves nature. I love just waxing poetic about the natural world as a big hiker and camper. And two, I love internal monologue, especially in regards to the philosophical reaction or the psychological reaction to the strange. As I always say that my stories are less about the monster than the human reaction to the monster. And that's something that I love to delve into.
And Rob?
I write philosophically oriented, hard science fiction, hard meaning the science when it is real, is accurate, and when it's extrapolated is reasonable. And so it's a literature of ideas for me. Yes, I have very moving scenes, lots of character interaction and so forth. But what I love to write the most is two people with opposing philosophical point of views chewing over a really meaty philosophical issue. I just love the sparks that can fly. That, people are often told in creative writing courses, fiction is about conflict. I'm not even sure that I agree with that, but the conflict that between two people can be between two different perspectives on an interesting issue without anybody ever throwing a punch. And it can still be, if you do it well, as scintillating as any action scene anybody has ever written.
Yeah, I remember, Rob, you said that at one point that you sold Calculating God as just a reasonable discussion between a creationist or a intelligent design perspective and an atheist perspective.
Exactly, that's right.
Cool.
That's right. Yeah. Calculating God, a novel of mine that came out in 2000 from Tor Books in New York. Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was a great book.
Well, I appreciate that too. Thank you.
Okay, very, very good, very intelligent answers. Thank you. Thank you, panel. So we've talked about what scenes we like to write. So I would like to get into a little bit more on views about writing characters who are not of your self-identity. So, the old saw, write what you know, write what you're familiar with. Do you feel, as a writer, is that valid? In other words, can someone of one particular group, and I know this might be controversial, but can someone of one particular group write effectively about characters in other particular groups? Yes or no? Why or why not?
Yes, absolutely. Without question, I have done it and have been praised for it throughout my career. Whether you should or not, there's some who claim, and the term, we went through the debate here in Canada in the 90s that is now gripping the rest of the literary world 30 years later, of appropriation of voice, of whether it's appropriate, correct, for me to write a story from another point of view. That's a separate question from whether, in fact, it can be done. Of course it can be done. Mark has written stories from the point of view of a dog, he was just telling us, right? Well, I'm seeing him here on video. Now, if this was only an audio podcast, as they say in that famous cartoon on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, right? But Mark looks suspiciously like Homo sapiens to me, and yet he's written from the point of view of a dog. Who said they'd written or read a book? You, Leslie, just said you'd read a book with no human characters in it.
Correct,
I've done
yeah.
that too.
Yeah.
You talk science fiction, fantasy, and horror writers. If you can't write the other of some sort, you can't write those genres. We are not doing fiction imitative of real life. And, when people are told, and this is, again, one of those canards that's drawn out or thrown out in introductory creative writing classes, write what you know. Most people don't know jack. Write what you can find out about. Write what you can learn. Write what you can go out and discover and experience and report back to the rest of the world on it. Even if it's something that you've gone out and experienced only through extrapolative rigor that goes with the world building of writing good science fiction or fantasy. Yes, absolutely, 100%, without question, since the dawn of time, since in the birth of my genre, science fiction, since a woman, Mary Shelley, had the temerity to write a novel about a man, Victor Frankenstein, we have known for sure that it absolutely can be done, and can be done well.
Thank you.
I think the write what you know, for me, just philosophically, we all kind of at bottom know the same thing as humanity, as this human race. And so I think one reason I love speculative fiction is that so many aspects of it transcend, tribalism, culture. We're all going to be looking up in wonder at the visiting aliens, and our reaction to it is going to be filtered through our immediate culture and, of course, and who we are and everything and what community we grew up in. But I think it's a very important exercise to stretch your empathic imagination to maybe, if you have a fan base that wouldn't necessarily read someone outside of their comfort zone for whatever reason, you can be the catalyst for them to open up to other voices and other perspectives. Having said that, you need to be very authentic. You need to do it, genuinely, with a genuine heart. You need to know what you're talking about. You need to do your research. You can't default to cliches or so it's a gnarly topic, but I think that it's the people who do it best. It's doing it best is its own answer. I think it can, like Rob said, it can be done and it should be done, but you really need to know your stuff.
Yeah, we've had this conversation, you and I, Mike, and
right.
and yes, we've had this conversation before. So, thank you, Mark.
So I think three things. I have spent a lot of time digging. So I interweave historical characters into my time travel books, because my books are about a young man who's in colonial Virginia. And so, it's ripe with different characters. And so I read a lot of biographies and trying to dig into the biographies, and now to see, kind of the human weakness, the kind of things that make these characters flawed, so I've tried to do that. The other thing is that I think when I started, I wasn't a very good writer of female characters, for whatever reason that is. Even though I have daughters and, the whole deal. So having a female editor has helped me quite a bit, with I have reactions to characters or the way that they, that they're dealing with something, and she'll go, no, that's just not right. That just isn't, how a woman would say it, and so that's helped quite a bit. And then kind of the third thing is that there have been characters that I've stayed away from just because I didn't think I could do them justice. And people have asked me, well, how come you don't have this kind of character in your book? Or how come you don't have this kind of character? And I go, well, look, I don't think I could represent that person as well as you want me to represent them. Right. So, there's some I'll just stay away from, and that feels very cowardly, but,
well, there sorry, there does seem to be a contradiction there sometimes where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You know, if
Yeah.
you don't represent, then they ask you why you didn't represent certain, you know, points of view. Then if you do and you don't do it well, you don't do it well in their eyes, they come down on you as well. So it's interesting.
Right. So I there's so many things I want to write and so many stories I want to tell. And, I remember actually having a deep conversation with somebody. I'm like, look, that's not the story I wanted to tell. If that's a story that you want to tell, then, we were at a writer's conference. So I'm like, sit down and do it. Right.
Well, this is a good segue actually into another deeper, maybe a bit more difficult question. So, Mike, you just mentioned about feeling about representing both Mike and Mark about representation. So, have any of you, either of you or any of you, I should say, do you now or have you always considered how marginalized groups are represented or not represented in speculative fiction as a whole? And have you or do you make an effort to include marginalized groups in your own work? And this question is not meant to be confrontational or judgmental in any way. I'm just asking to just get the conversation started out there.
Yes. And yes.
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes. It's interesting because sometimes characters, I mean, all the time, characters come to me and they just suggest themselves, and they're not always white. And there's no particular reason why they might not be white. It's just like that's who they are. And I roll with it, and I do what I can again to imbue them with the kind of humanity that I can, that I think everyone experiences to some degree, and then of course doing the finer points on who they are culturally, psychologically, in terms of more immediate identity. So yeah, absolutely. Yes,
and yes. Yes, absolutely. I've been doing it since the dawn of my career. As I say, I've been a published author for 42 years now. The ethnic and gender orientation and religious diversity in my work, it speaks for itself. But, you don't include a person of a specific group necessarily to represent that group. I was pitching in Hollywood. An adaptation of my novel Triggers, and in Triggers, one of the main characters is a Sikh, right? And somebody I was talking to said, why is he a Sikh? And I said, why not? Right? There are 20 million Sikhs in the world. You're bound to run into them in various places, right? You don't just bring in the Sikh when you want to have a discussion about Sikhism. You don't just bring in the Jewish character when you want to deal with, we're going to do a novel about anti-Semitism. You're just as likely to have a Jewish character who is involved in any other characteristic, an atheist or a white bald man like myself, a person of color, of all the different ways that a person of color can be. I've twice been nominated for the Galactic Spectrum Award for positive representations of LGBTQ plus people in science fiction and fantasy. And I'm, as I like to say, flamingly heterosexual, but inclusiveness means showing diversity, not to make, you make the point that we live in a diverse world, but you don't say, oh, okay, I'm telling a story about, the Asian experience, and therefore I need an Asian character. You're telling a story about the human experience.
Yeah.
And therefore you need you have Asians, you have
like
people of color, you have people of different sexual orientations, different religious beliefs. You show the panoply of humanity because humanity is diverse.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot easier to find nowadays. It's a lot easier to find works of fiction with diverse casts of characters in it than it certainly used to be, and also in visual media, of course, in TV and movies, it's better. Mark, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I do.
As you asked the three, I didn't interrupt, Mark, but as you asked the three white guys about our opinion of inclusiveness here. But okay, Mark, fellow white guy, at least you're not fellow bald white guy like me and Mike, but fellow white guy, what do you think of this topic here?
Well, I write books about colonial America, right? And so I have to tiptoe around this topic quite a bit. And then I actually interweave characters that you would recognize. So Thomas Jefferson has a big part in my book, and he is now interacting with a modern day scientist who comes with, a perspective on, the contradictions in his life. And I have to weigh, here's the story I want to tell. Okay. But then I also have to build in some subtle kinds of things that are going on that are saying, look, two things. One, this isn't right. Number two, this is going to stain your legacy into perpetuity, and that's kind of where I've kind of chosen to deal with this. And I don't want to, I'm not the expert in the best way to handle this, and so I'm trying to, deal with it as I see my story fits. But really there has to be some, and at least my fourth book anyway, I'm a better writer now. And I have to, and I've just been discussing this with my editor, and she's going, I don't know if you want to put this in. And I'm like, no, I got to deal with it. I got to deal with it. I got to deal with Jefferson's legacy right now. He's got to know what he's doing. And that's kind of the thing. And so, I'm not saying that it's not in my characters. It's about the people that are dealing with the issues that we're still talking about today, right? So,
have any of you ever used what are, I guess, some are referred to as like cultural sensitivity or sensitivity readers to help you with any characters that you might be worried that you're not representing as well as you can? I'm asking because I had an experience of in the my New Tierra Chronicles of using a cultural sensitivity reader, and it was very valuable. It helped me a lot. So I was wondering if any of you had done the same.
I don't perceive of myself as a culturally insensitive writer. Mm-hmm. So I don't believe, in fact, that the notion that the writer is a insensitive dolt and needs some expert to come in to tell me how to do it. I also don't need somebody to come in and tell me to, if I need expertise in a particular area, I will ask for it. But the notion that in this particular area, I live in Toronto. Toronto is recognized by UNESCO as the most multicultural city on the planet. My life has been an immersion in multiculturalism. My family includes a variety of gender orientations, people of different age groups, people who are native to Canada. I'm lucky enough to be an officiant at Canadian citizenship ceremonies. I've sworn in over 1,000 new Canadian citizens to become part of this wonderfully diverse mosaic that is my country. And this self-selective notion, it's self-selective. People saying, excuse me, I want my take to be the one that takes precedence over the author's own lived life experience that he, she, or they are trying to share, and say, I've been selected either by you or by your publisher to have veto power over how you have perceived the world. And so-called culturally sensitive readers are in fact simply people with a specific perspective and often an agenda. You bring in a culturally sensitive reader about the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Well, find me one who is completely neutral on that issue and is going to fairly tell me how I should address that in a discussion, right? If you get a culturally sensitive person of color who is your reader, and that culturally sensitive person of color is Clarence Thomas, his perspective is going to be way, way different than many other people of color's perspective is going to be. And yet he would have that veto power if he is the one privileged representative of that group who has been appointed the culturally sensitive reader. I think the whole notion is sadly misguided virtue signaling by the big five publishing companies.
Thank you. All good points.
I generally have beta readers, and I'm lucky enough to have had access and to continue to have access to beta readers who are relevant to the story that I'm telling and that I want feedback on. So I've never used a particular professional sensitivity editor. I will say that the first time I ever heard of a sensitivity editor, it left a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth, because springboarding off of what Rob said, it was a novelist friend of mine who took a UCLA course, and part of the course was her having to finish a manuscript and then send it to a sensitivity editor. Well, the editor took the novel itself was about an Indian woman, and she was white, and her name was Catherine Stewart. But the editor actually didn't know she was white. She just saw her name and then didn't even read the book. It was like, based on your name, this isn't your culture. You shouldn't be writing this. I'm not going to even look at it. Which I think is, I mean, how does she know? Like the Canadian comic Russell Peters is Indian Canadian,
right?
But he sounds
very
like
talented,
a white, yeah, he sounds like a white guy if you just look at his name. So, that I'm not saying that they don't serve a function. They don't do good work sometimes, but yeah, I'm suspicious of them too. Just, make sure that the people who are relevant to your story read your story as well as you can.
And I just, if I can add on to that, Mark, you're absolutely right. But how offensive is it to hand a manuscript to somebody and say, comment on the Judaism in here? Right. I don't care if you like the characters or the plot, or if I got the science right, or it just, I'm coming to you as a very narrow definition of who you are. Forget that. I have, as I'm sure Mike and Mark do, a variety of beta readers who happen to represent a variety of positions and points of view. But to say, I want your opinion on this narrow facet is a compartmentalizing, dehumanizing reduction of that full human being, and that isn't right either.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for saying that. Mark, anything to add?
I don't think so. I think you guys have said it. I don't work with the sensitivity readers. I think in the end, I'm going to, what's going to happen is, I'm going to do the research. I'm going to, my art is going to go down on the page, and ultimately I'm going to have to defend the art. And it's certain things I don't want people messing with, right? And I'm willing to take the chance. I am. I do think I work in a very multicultural environment. I'm a scientist, so people all over the world, and so I hope I have a perspective. I hope I have that kind of sensitivity. But in the end, it's gonna be my art, and I'm hoping that I've researched it enough to at least accurately reflect some perspective that's correct.
Well, I did it once, and I did find it helpful, but I'm certainly not going to make a habit out of it, because I agree with basically everything all of the other three panelists have said about it. Ultimately, we're the artists, we're the authors, we create the characters, and it's our creation.
And your job as an author is not to be blandly acceptable to everybody.
Exactly.
You make your living by being the favorite author of a very narrow segment of the reading public. Now, that doesn't mean that you should be offensive as a purpose. But if you set out to not offend anybody, and I'll mention in passing, as we were leading into this conversation, we were told, there's certain words, if you say them in this discussion, the automatic algorithms at YouTube will flag as potentially contentious material. So not even to mention things that are purely normal discourse in any topic you might have at a cafe or a coffee shop today. But if you try to not offend anybody, everybody will read. Everybody you manage to convince, that precious few to read your book, will go, it was okay.
Right.
And that's all you will ever do, is get and that is not your job as an artist.
Well, lovely. That's such great, intelligent answers. So let's get a little bit lighter here. We've been kind of delving into some serious stuff. So how do y'all come up with the names for your characters? Do you use like fantasy name generators, or do you just get to the go to the internet and say, let me look at list of best baby names, that sort of thing?
Well, Leslie Ann, this is I mostly write science fiction set in the near future, so maybe the year 2040, right? So if I have a character who's 30 in 2040, that means they were born in 2010. And I do go to the internet and I go to this country that I'm in. It'll be Canada, the United States, or Australia, wherever I'm setting a story, somewhere in Nairobi, whatever it is, and get the most popular baby names for male or female of the year in which my character was born, because that gives an authenticity, right? In the future, there will be, if it happens that a particular year that the most popular boy's name is Dexter, which was a complete geek name when I was a kid, and then became a very cool name when Dexter the serial killer. Imagine naming your kid after a serial killer. But, these things have names come in and out of fashion, right? When I was a kid, if you saw the name Gladys or Sophie, right, or Ruth, you immediately thought of somebody's grandmother, right? So that works very effectively for me.
Mark, what about you?
Since I read a lot of history, and I interweave characters in with my main character, you're going to find a lot of actual real people who lived. And I've managed to, as I said, interweave their actual lives into the story. And so my editor at times, she's gone, I just read somewhere that there's a character, Patrick Ferguson. I read somewhere that he was a real person. I'm like, of course he was, and I managed and I tried to interweave, what was going on in his life into what was going on in my character's life. Otherwise, I go to English surnames again, because that's the period. And, and I just like strong, simple men's names anyway. And so I use a
Mark. There's a name. It's a man's name. And then Rose. Okay, I think this is compensation, my friend.
So, my names are all very common and very English. So boring.
I don't have a calculated way of doing it. It's very up in the air. Usually a name just kind of pops in there out of the ether, along with the picture of the character and what they're about. Sometimes
Great
if that
sound
doesn't,
effect there, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Sometimes that's the literal sound that I hear. Sometimes I might have a first name, not a last name, vice versa. Sometimes I don't have a name at all. If that's the case, I just, I wait on it, I sit on it, and then I might come across something in reading. I meet a person who has a cool name. I might want to, pilfer that name. So I think very rarely do I actually go and look at baby names, and it's sort of my last resort.
Mm. Well, in my New Tierra Chronicles series, it's based on a Latin culture. The people speak Spanglish on this planet of New Tierra, and so a lot of the names are, of course, Latinized names. So I have a bookmark on my computer, the well-known or common, popular names for Latino children. So I'll use that. So,
that works.
But okay, we're getting a little close to the end of the discussion here. But I'd like to ask one more serious question and then one funny question. So my serious question is, do you believe writer's block is real? And
No.
if so, why or why not?
No. Writer's block. What a profession to be a writer. No other profession in the world can you say to the world, I got teacher's block today. Can't really teach the class. I've got receptionist block today. Sorry, somebody else is going to have to sign people in. I've got street cleaner block today. Can you go do it for me? And you can't. Because we're so good at telling lies for a living, we managed to convince the world of this lie that actually is incredibly self-destructive, and people bought it. I can't work today. I've got writers. Oh, he's got block. Okay, leave it. Nothing you can do about it. If you're stuck at a particular portion in your manuscript, go write some other portion of your manuscript, right? Don't write in a linear fashion. Don't say, okay, most writer's block comes down to, I don't know what happens immediately next after the sentence I just wrote. But if you left the guy hanging on a cliff, he's going to get off that cliff. jump ahead a few chapters, write something there, go back a few chapters, and if you've done a fairly skeletal first draft, add in some description. But it is the absolutely most pernicious lie that we ever sold to the world that somehow we, privileged amongst all other laborers on the planet, can opt out of working for this magical excuse that we're blocked.
I don't believe
sorry,
in
go
it
ahead.
either myself, but go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I don't believe in it either. You just got to keep working. Hemingway used to just tap the E key over and over until something came. You just got to keep yourself in motion, keep the wheels greased.
I have too many ideas.
Yeah, it was the old
Right,
man
exactly.
in the E for the longest
Right,
time.
there you go.
Yeah. And then they
I mean, the closest that I can say that I've come to writer's block is really just not feeling motivated to continue, because I've felt like what I've done before it's just a crisis of confidence about what I've done before. And so usually what I do, I go back for that day and I just edit and I revise what I've already done, and that makes me feel better and it opens up the floodgates. But yeah, you just got to keep working in whatever fashion.
Mark,
Yeah,
what
I
about
think
you?
I can't remember who said it. Somebody said the cure to writer's block is butt glue. Sit down and just keep writing. But I think it was Frank Herbert, and the Dune books have been like my life's passion, right? That's been something and I think Frank Herbert was the one. He said, when I sit down and I have this thing that people describe as writer's block and I write something, or when I'm passionate and I have this inspiration and I write something, he said, I look at them in the end and they're the same quality. They're entirely, just me forcing myself to write versus, these inspirational moments. I look back and I can't tell the difference. And I've done that. I've done that best, when I've really had to drag myself up in the morning and really force an idea. And I look back at it and I go, hey, this was pretty good for being so darn uninspired, right? So, yeah, I don't believe
100%, Mark. Yeah.
I think, as I said, I have like too many ideas. I have more ideas than I have life left on this planet. And so if and Mike, I agree with you about like the closest I've ever come to writer's block is just not feeling motivated to write a particular story for a while.
Yeah.
But oftentimes I'll just leave it for a while, and I still think about the characters and the story all the time, and I still know what's going to happen. So I'll go and work on something else that's more interesting to me at the time, and then I'll come back to it. But yeah, that I never believed in that thing about writer's block. It's never made any sense to me at all. Not the least bit. Just because my head has always just been bursting with ideas. Like, how could I have writer's block? I got so many stories I got to tell.
Yeah.
So it makes no sense.
It might just be hungover. I don't know.
Yeah.
Excuse.
So real quick, what is your favorite work of fiction?
Oh, geez. Off the top of my head.
Off the top of your head.
Probably Damien by Herman Hesse.
Okay.
I love the philosophy of it. I love the kind of the slight magical realism. But I mean, that would be, yeah.
Okay. Rob, what about you?
To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And for the same reason I love science fiction, because it's not about what it appears to be about. When you start reading that novel, it appears to be just the reminiscences about a fun summer when these two kids had another kid come to stay at the next door neighbor's house. And it ends up being this incredibly powerful indictment of racism. It's just an absolutely masterful book.
Mark?
So I'm going to say, I mentioned Dune, but I want to say the book that I always remember, and it's a book that my father gave me when I was young, The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury. It is the book that explained science fiction to me maybe when I was 10. And I realized then that science fiction actually isn't about science at all. It's about humanity, right? And that was it. That's always the one I remember.
Right. Well, off the top of my head, I would have to say Sense and Sensibility. So.
Oh, nice.
I always remember that book. It's the just pure purpleness of the prose is so delicious. It has just informed my writing style. I kind of look at my writing style as like neo-Victorian. I love the purple prose. So yeah, Sense and Sensibility, love that book. Also Wuthering Heights, great book. Really, really grim, but great book. Okay, last question before we wrap things up. Pineapple on pizza, yes or no? Mike.
Despite the fact, Mike, okay.
Go.
Well,
if there are no alternatives, sure. I'll and I'm hungry, I'll have it. Yeah, it's not my first choice, but I'm not grossed out by it.
Okay, Rob.
Despite the fact that that is a Canadian invention, the Hawaiian pizza, it's an abomination.
All right, Mark.
It's so funny because I just had this same conversation with somebody Friday before I left work. And we were having these delicious pineapple chocolate things that somebody left out. And the guy goes, I don't like pineapple. And I said, I guess you don't like pineapple pizza then. He goes, no way. Who would ruin pizza like that? Right. So I'm definitely, I'm in that same, I'm in that same boat. I can't understand why you put pineapple on your pizza.
Okay, well, I love pineapple on pizza. Yes, it is fantastic, delicious. The sweet, the juxtaposition of the sweet and savory is just sublime. Love it.
But see, it's polarizing. It's a good metaphor for what Rob was talking about. It's got its hardcore fans.
What's your sensitive reader going to say about that, right? Well, if they're Hawaiian, they're going to say, don't name it after us because we're not responsible.
I didn't know that was a Canadian invention.
It is,
yeah. I learned
Canadian restaurant was the first guy to do it.
That's fantastic. Well,
basketball too.
This has been a really great panel. Thank you, all of you. What great questions. Thank you, moderator, for the great questions. Come on, everybody.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great questions, Leslie.
And great answers, all of you. So I want to give everybody a time to shamelessly plug themselves. So let's start with Mark. Shamelessly plug yourself, please.
Well, the new book, my website is markjroseauthor.com. There you can see the new book, all three of the books that have already been published. And then the fourth book, Architect in the series, should be out at the end of the year. Also, my blog is there. And so when I get writer's block, I write in my blog. So check it out, markjroseauthor.com.
Excellent. Okay, Mike.
So my website is mike-robinsonauthor.com. There you can sign up for my newsletter, where I send out a monthly newsletter. Weird, Wondrous, Right Life. Weird covers news from the possibly supernatural, paranormal. Wondrous covers the natural sciences and new science news. And Right Life is about me and other authors that I know, and news from that world. As I mentioned earlier, I've got in May 2023, I've got a new horror fantasy coming out called Walking in the Dusk. It's about a physics professor who has to confront a supernatural force that he encountered in his childhood. And so that would be my nutshell. Yeah.
Sounds spooky.
Yeah.
Okay, and Rob.
My website is sfwriter.com. Over 1 million words of text to be found there, including tons of how to write advice. And my latest novel is right there, The Oppenheimer Alternative, a hard SF alternate history about the Manhattan Project.
Okay.
Nice.
And you can find me at leslieannmoore.com. I am also on the Twitters and the Facebooks. Leslie Ann Moore, just look me up, Leslie Ann Moore author. I'm also on the Instagram, where I post mainly pictures of my cosplay and sewing projects, but I also post stuff about my work. And my latest series, the New Tierra Chronicles, here is the cover, Skein of Fates. That's the first one. It is available where all fine online book sources, the Zon, Smashwords, Kobo, iBooks, all of those places in ebook, paperback, and hardcover. The next book in the series, called Hand of the Dictatress, will be out December 2022. So it will also be found everywhere that you can buy fine books online. So thank you very much, panel, for your time, your wonderful answers. It was fantastic. Give yourselves a hand. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.